Hey guys, this is miicrow here. Chat and I put together a tier list for OPR solo queue players yesterday. It was pretty fun on the stream, but there are a lot of builds to go over. I want to be more so talking about general trends for this. If you guys want to actually see the detailed analysis, just like talk, not really analysis, but just talk in the Discord. We can talk about it, or just like watch the stream back. But the main ideas here are the actual builds that were played. I think we saw a bigger variety of these builds kind of being played within the last like time we did this, which is like November. And then like as the meta has progressed, as like not really many PvP balance changes have come out, to be honest, it's just been like more and more refined. There's been less builds that are being used. The only build that chat thought was like SS tier this time was Firestaff Blunderbuss. Versus last time we had like 5 builds that were SS tier, for example. Like there's just like in general, things are just like kind of more concentrated. It's like more defined opinions. I mean, this is kind of expected because when November came out, it was like artifact season. Like everyone's like, oh my god, you can play all these builds. There are a lot of like kind of niche builds that we all thought would be good and then just turned out to not be nearly as good. Like Flail SNS, like that build went from being the top of the top, being a very solid build. Everyone kind of liked it. It was like S tier to now it's not like really played at all. It's just like completely outclassed by Great Sword with the sword, completely outgrasped by Spear with the sword. It does not really make sense to play that build much at all anymore just because it lacks damage. And there's things like that just have just been refined overall, and it will be interesting to see how some of these balance changes kind of work out. But I want to talk about like a few highlights here. So this is like kind of chat's kind of oriented thing for V2. Some things that are kind of noteworthy here that I think are a little bit underrated. Bow Rapier, with just kind of the prevalence of bugs. I think Bow Rapier is actually like it's relatively bow rapiers bipolarizing because there's like bow rapiers who like know the exploits and who don't know the exploits. And if you know the exploits, this is like an SS tier weapon. But if you don't know the exploits, this is like a B tier weapon. And if you're new to the game and you just picked up bow, this is like an F tier weapon. Like it is like the most like skill dependent weapon just because there's so many ways to reduce the amount of time it takes to fire a shot off, whether that be from using rain of arrows to kind of animation cancel, or from just like doing this weird heavy attack animation thing that doesn't involve crouch anymore. It's kind of a newer technique, but it's just like bow rapier is like really bipolarizing, and then that kind of comes into effect on top of, which I think is really good, by the way, because it's actually shows skill with the weapon versus fire staff is kind of you just throw your stuff out there, and it just does about the same power level no matter what player you are, and it's more about target acquisition rather than mechanical skill, and it's cool to have those kind of weapons. So I'm kind of a fan of that personally, but I could definitely understand why people would not be a fan of that. But the consequence of that too, and like how that compounds with Boltcaster, with this kind of elemental damage that is not being skilled for PvP, which is like 14%. That's not being skilled in PvP, which turns out to be about a 16% damage increase because you have to do like 1 over 1 minus 14%. So Boltcaster inherently is doing a significant amount more damage. On top of that, like bonus damage, it's all compounding times these other damage factors, like the fact that you have Shirking Lightning, which is another multiplicative factor that exists. You have Ammo on Bow, which is another multiplicative factor that exists. You have Electrified. And because you have all these factors that are like multiplying by each other, you effectively are compounding the magnitude of this bug. And that's why Boltcaster is now hitting people for 8k, hitting people for 10k who are not warded to it. And it's just like really, really crazy. And that's something that definitely needs to be addressed as soon as possible. I'm really hoping too that they could fix some other bugs with artifacts when they go for this. Like Life Taker doesn't do damage with negative energy if you don't have the right attribute scaling. It seems like attribute scaling is inherent with the base functionality of the artifacts, especially for Life Taker and for the Inferno. Like if you use the Inferno for strength, it literally makes no sense because your dots are not doing any damage. But if you use it for int, then you're losing a perk because you have inherent power. So like this weapon literally makes no sense to ever run. And there's a few other artifacts like that are just like very, very frustrating. You compare that to something like Pestilence, which is just like super consistent. You can just kind of run it everywhere, just like a solid disease, and there's like no reason like why to like not really run that from like a solo queue perspective and like all these other game modes. It's starting to fall off a bit in War. I think just because it lacks the burst that some other kind of different variants have, and you need that burst right now because everyone is running Void Darkplate. Everyone's running Frigid Dawn gear, which to AGS's credit, this is the one use I think Magnify everyone has kind of generally been in agreement that this is good, even though a lot of people would rather have that be like a slot down, like choose your attribute thing. Like if this was con, half the builds that run it would not be able to run it. If this was like strength, half the builds that run it wouldn't be able to run it. So Magnify really kind of saved this kind of a kind of exclusive piece, but it is shaping the meta in a way where you kind of have to run this, and if you don't run these gear pieces, you are just going to get farmed, and you're mostly getting farmed by builds that are bugged. In particular, ones that run the bolt caster are just going to be kind of destroying you, which is not ideal by any means, and that's just because of that one bug. I imagine this will likely get fixed next week if people, or if AGS is like kind of on top of things. There's also a small chance that AGS like completely messes this up and just doesn't realize that it is bugged, and that they buff bow in PvE, they nerf bow according in PvP, and because the PvE buffs translate to PvP, because the PvE buffs are buffing everything, right? So when they do a increase to PvE, they typically, for the PvP side, to compensate, they just go the other way. And because of that, it nets even for PvP. But when you have this concept where the PvP net negative does not matter anymore, if they buff the PvE side and then nerf the PvP side, Boltcaster just got another buff, and now instead of hitting for 8k, for 10k, I'm not exaggerating about this, by the way, it actually hits for 8 to 10k. It hits for 12k or something like that, and we're like, whoa, wait a second here. Like, Boltcaster is like getting really, really ridiculous, and that compounds on top of all the animation cancels, compounds on top of all these other aspects that just increase that damage by a multiplicative factor, which is why it seems super, super strong right now, and why artifacts in particular, or any weapon that has ammo associated with it, is really, really scary, because the instant you add an ammo, you have another compounding factor, and that compounding factor, if there's another one that's added to that, will just kind of get out of control very, very quickly, which is why you have some metas where Boltcaster is insane, or like a bow is insane. You have some metas where musket is insane. You have some metas where blunderbuss is insane, and that's basically the fundamental reason why those weapons just get so crazy, out of control so quickly. But from my tier list perspective, I think there's a little bit more to add to SS tier. Like, Sword Spear is a super, it's not underrated. It's like a super strong build that if you haven't seen it, you've kind of been under a rock at this point. But the idea here is that you no longer want to go for the artifact spear with most people that are running spear. It just doesn't make sense to try to pull people in and kind of burst them down when you have to give up so much. The cooldown is super high for Scorpion Sting. It's a skill shot that if you miss, you have to wait 25 seconds. There are a few builds that still use it, like Spear Ice Gauntlet. As much as that build seems like it should not exist, it still does exist, and people pull healers and drop an ice shower behind them, and they just die every single time in a war. So Scorpion Sting still has some place. Like, that build just typically is not as good anymore. Just makes more sense to go Sword and Shield with the Spear, just play for the disruption. The thing that Spear brings to the table, unlike Flail, is it has disruption, but actually has really good damage, and it can actually win a 1v1 versus a Great Axe Warhammer, which Flail cannot. So it's just like, it does so much, and it's just like good in every game mode. The thing that people tend to run with this, for people that aren't aware, they go Void Darkplate with this, like most people, and then they'll go for Shirking Fort, they'll stack Shirking Heals, they'll go for like health or some other defensive perk, like Conditioning. I would slightly prefer Conditioning, but health makes sense too for that kind of role, because you're already super tanky, and the health kind of compounds with the Shirking Heals, and you just become like borderline invincible. This is one of those builds that like has single-handedly made it, I think, so that healer is no longer SS tier, because this build doesn't need a healer to fundamentally operate and can still do everything you want to do just because it has so much healing. That being said, when I'm talking about all this, there is something that people kind of aren't as familiar with right now that's a little bit weird, where I don't think Ankh is necessarily BIS anymore, and the reason for this is this center of attention went from a bucket that was super uncontested, so it was like super strong before, to being in a bucket now where it is super contested. If actually, from like an Ankh perspective, I think the center of attention buff is worth about a 15% damage increase when you're playing in a Sacred, which if you're with Ankh, you probably want to be playing in Sacreds because it's built around getting healed more, so it just naturally makes sense. When this Divine is actually basically doing the same thing. So if you really want to be like technical about it, I think if you really want this kind of effect and you want a middle ground, it's very optimal to go for a Divine Health protection amulet, because that's what's typically being run right now. And instead of going for one of these typical artifacts like the going for Ankh, you instead go for Endless Thirst. Endless Thirst, for people that don't know, is like a jewelry artifact that is super prevalent right now, super popular, super strong. The idea here is the thirst actually makes it so your pots heal for something. If you run around with Ankh, your pots might heal you for 4k. With this, it's probably closer to 8k. Very significant from the health pot, but you eat that with the cooldown. The other thing about this is it pops off of the actual pots that are not as used anymore. So if I look at infused flame protection pots, that one's not, or infused fire protection, that one's not as used much anymore. But you had like infused lightning absorption pots. Those will actually proc the endless thirst effects. That will both give you an empower and a fortifying toast. These got buffed recently to be twice as long, which just allows it to be super strong, procs all the time. It also does not increase the cooldown of anything that's not an actual health pot itself, so it won't increase the cooldown of a cleanse pot, won't increase the cooldown of an infused fire absorption pot, so it just inherently just brings a lot of value to those kind of builds, and I think it's super slept on, and people just have not adjusted accordingly yet. So that's something to kind of look out for in the near future. Fire Staff's still really good. I think we're starting to see a transition away from Fire Staff BB to Fire Staff Rapier from a war scene perspective, because Fire Staff Rapier just has more burst. But that being said, within OPR where healing is not prevalent because we don't have matchmaking yet, I expect that to be the announcement in May, just based off of like how the tone was set in the previous PvP video. I think that once that, like, until that change comes out, Fire Staff Blunderbuss will still be SS tier and OPR. The other thing about this build too is you could just kind of pick it up and play it. There's not like too much of a skill curve involved with it, so basically any player can play that, versus Fire Staff Rapier is a little bit more skill dependent, which is why it's a little bit lower. Otherwise, it's just kind of more the typical stuff. If you're going to be a solo queue in OPR, Great Axe Warhammer is not your best friend. There's a few builds on here that are like kind of underrated. Great Axe Blunderbuss is a super underrated, like kind of up and coming build. I think it's super strong in OPR and could start to make an appearance in war at some point. I think this is a build that actually allows you to generate a lot of kills and just have good pressure in those clump fights, which is really lacking right now. It feels more like a slap fight. And this is like one of those builds that like you can play it for clump and it can do very well. You could play it as like a solo kind of disruptor oriented thing, and because Crippling Reap got changed to be like unconditional, it just turns out to be like super effective to just like prevent people from moving, because they just are not able to move when they're slowed by 50% for 4 seconds, and then that just sets you up for your BB. BB could just put people to shreds. You no longer have that like kind of awkward conditional, and you're just kind of a menace with this build. I've seen not a little bit of clips, but more so like OPR highlights of people getting like 49, 50 kills with this build. It's absolutely doing more than Musket now. It's doing more than bows even at times, so something to keep your eye out for sure. But yeah, overall, definitely a few builds that are better now. A lot of builds that are kind of falling off a bit, but just kind of like keep your eyes out for the recent PvP changes. The heavy changes are up and coming. I don't expect to influence the meta much at all, because they are gonna have to nail a few bugs, which are very unlikely to be nailed at the current moment. One of these is Hardy. Hardy, where it says here it's 10% more stam, it's actually not 10% more stam. If we look at New World Buddy and then we look at Hardy, Hardy actually gives slightly more than 10% more stam. And where this comes into play is when the AGS is talking about increasing the stamina cost to 55%. If we're at 10.45% more stam, that's actually still 3 dodges, so it effectively does nothing, the change that they're proposing, but the idea of the change I think is better than the direction of nerfing medium's dodge back to normal, because that kind of medium dodge spam meta was just like not very good for the game, on top of Spear inherently getting an indirect buff that not a lot of people know about, where Spear got this evasive maneuvers buff to make it so that if after you hit someone, dodges just cost 20% less for 2 seconds, versus before you had to be dodging backwards. And it was just like more awkward to use. Now you can kind of use it to follow up people. You can do a technique where you just go for your first light attack, then dodge the first light attack and dodge, and you just naturally win the stam trade with Spear versus any other weapon in the game, including Life Staff. And that first hit of your Spear autos just tends to have better tracking in a second, so it's just like able to close distance very well, be super effective, and is one of the reasons why I consider this build to be in SS tier right now. It's just like there's so many things going for it, it just naturally makes sense. But with that being said, let me know if you guys noticed anything else that I forgot to rate, or if you think something is like really interesting here, or notice something that just like in general that's like super interesting for you guys to like kind of go at from like an OPR standpoint, like that change to there's like I think it's a ghost change, but Zephyr Cakes now give 15% haste, even though it only says 10%. There's like some other weird things too, that I could make videos about in the future, but I don't think they're like interesting enough to warrant a full video on themselves yet. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next video.